Hi, hello, and welcome to this episode of Geography Girl. Today, I'm going to be telling you the incredible story of the occupation of Paris by the Nazi Party during the Second World War, and how the Führer exploited the Parisians' right to the city to diminish morale and cultural identity. Paris was one of Europe's most loved cities, and Hitler certainly looked at it for inspiration for his own capital of his new German empire, Germania. Once on its knees, Paris kept on with its resistance, taking back its city by August of 1944. Let's jump into the episode. On the 14th of June 1940, Parisians woke to the sound of German voices announcing that the city should follow a strict 8 p.m. curfew to allow German troops to enter and occupy the city. Tanks rolled into Paris and the Gestapo got to work, arresting, interrogating and spying on the city's civilians. 1 month before, the German Wehrmacht had stormed France within a week, France had signed an armistice with the Germans and a puppet state was set up. The country was divided into two. Germany occupied all of northern France, the Atlantic coastline down to the border with Spain, and a new French government was established in the town of Vichy, collaborating with the Nazi Party to maintain autonomy in the southern and central France. Whilst 2 million had already fled, those who remained despaired for 4 dark years. Hitler was a lover of architecture and was quick to visit. He was accompanied by his architects Albert Speer, Hermann Gieseler, and Arno Breker. Just 3 days after the armistice was signed, the entourage of imposing cars rolled down the empty streets, with 2/3 of the city fleeing to the countryside. Paris is dead, not a human soul to be seen. The residential areas look like phantoms, as if they were separated from life, says Arnold Breker, who accompanied Hitler on his tour of Paris, acting as his guide. The cars moved towards the Champs-Élysées, admiring the view in the avenue. Stopping under the Arc de Triomphe, the group moved on to the Trocadero to see the Eiffel Tower on the other side of the Seine. The Führer did not want to miss the tomb of Napoleon and stood in awe looking at the Pantheon, which is dedicated to the greatest of French men and women. The convoy went on to the Notre Dame, passing over the river towards the Louvre and out of the city. While Speer reported that Hitler was not particularly interested in the most beautiful architectural works of the city, the tour did inspire him to resume construction of Germania in Berlin, the biggest city in the world and a monument of military and political might. Wasn't Paris beautiful? But Berlin must be made far more beautiful. In the past, I often considered whether we would not have to destroy Paris, he continued with great calm, as if he was talking about the most natural thing in the world. But when we are finished in Berlin, Paris will only be a shadow, so why should we destroy it? And with that, I was dismissed, records Albert Speer. Nazi occupation of Paris between 1940 and 44 presents a compelling historical lens to examine the concept of the right to the city, as articulated by French philosopher Henri Lefebvre in the 20th century. This theory advocates for citizens' right to access, to participate in and shape their urban spaces. In Nazi-occupied Paris, these rights were deeply contested, reshaped, and often violently suppressed. The heart and soul of the French nation during the occupation of Parisian inhabitants was systematically denied, with authorities imposing hierarchical control over urban spaces. They held the power to define who could move, work, and exist within the city. Many of its landmarks were taken over. Public spaces, such as parks, schools, and transportation systems, were segregated, often explicitly excluding Jewish citizens, and others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. Key landmarks in areas including the Opera Garnier and prestigious hotels were appropriated for German military and administrative purposes, restricting access to Parisians. Many of Paris's luxury hotels were requisitioned by Nazis, such as Le Maurice, which was repurposed as the headquarters of the Greater Paris. During the endgame of the beginning, in August 1944, a new military governor, Dietrich von Schiltz, took up permanent residency as he was under strict instructions to destroy the city rather than let it fall to the hands of allies. Hitler famously asked in the weeks following, "Is Paris burning?" to which von Schiltz could not answer. He set up explosives at the city's landmarks and under bridges, ready to press the big red button should he need to, but he couldn't bring himself to be the man who brought down the City of Light and Europe's most celebrated city. The Hotel Majestic was also taken up as a military headquarters. This is where deportation orders for Parisian Jews were processed. Here, the Führer's dissidents, the military commander of the German-occupied France, Karl Heinrich von Steubengal, designed an assassination plot on Hitler. After the war ended, the building became the first headquarters for UNESCO, and and in 2014, it returned to the scene as a hotel. Jacques Jaudard, the director of the National French Museum, in 1939 had the foresight to take out of the Louvre when war broke out, but there remained some 100,000 privately owned works. Anyone who left France's pieces were fair game, and so confiscated art was used for temporary exhibitions at the Louvre. High-ranking Nazi officials helped themselves to the pieces. Hermann Göring, the man in charge of the Luftwaffe, had himself over 1,300 pieces shipped back to Germany. At the end of the war, the famed Monuments Men helped bring back 60,000 works back to France. However, more than half of them were never returned to their owners. Other ways the right to the city was exploited was through surveillance and curfews. The Nazi regime enforced strict curfews, ID checks, and patrols that limited mobility, effectively turning Paris into a controlled and surveilled city. Jewish neighbourhoods in areas like Les Marais were heavily policed and later subject to deportation operations, profoundly altering the cultural and social geography. There was economic and cultural dispossession. Businesses, particularly owned by Jewish residences, were expropriated or Aryanized, disrupting livelihoods and transforming the urban economy. Cultural institutions and intellectual spaces, such as libraries and cafes, were monitored or repurposed to align with Nazi ideology, stifling free expression and participation in cultural life. In response to the occupation, acts of resistance by Parisians can be interpreted as attempts to reclaim their right to the city. These efforts range from overt sabotage to subtle acts of defiance. There was a cultural defiance, so resistance in literature, graffiti, and clandestine art movements that sought to reassert French identity and culture within the occupied urban space. Artists and intellectuals resisted Nazi cultural policies, often hosting secret gatherings, discuss ideas, and maintain a sense of cultural continuity. And in public, there were acts of rebellion. There were public demonstrations, which were risky and occasionally challenged the Nazi presence, with Parisians reclaiming streets and squares as spaces of protest. Examples include the liberation of Paris 1944, where Parisians actively dismantled Nazi symbols and restored French flags across the city. There was an impressive underground urban geography, such as hidden networks, like the catacombs and sewers of Paris, that served as spaces for resistance members to evade the German patrols, store supplies, and plan sabotage missions. There was a secret printing press and radio transmitters that were established in basements and hidden rooms, creating a network of communication of activism. And informal economies that flourished in the form of black markets, challenging Nazi control over resources and enabling Parisians to survive despite strict rationing. The liberation of Paris in 1944 marked a significant movement in reclaiming the right to the city, as Parisians worked to restore their cultural identity and rebuild their urban environment. This came in a form of memorialization, rebuilding, a physical reclamation. Parisian landmarks and neighbourhoods were gradually restored to reflect French heritage, removing traces of Nazi influence. The Champs-Élysées, where Hitler once rode down, was seized back in an explosive victory parade in the day after liberation. Today, a statue of Charles de Gaulle marches triumphantly down the avenue in front of the Grand Palais. Efforts to memorialise victims of the Holocaust and honour the resistance members began, reasserting a collective urban identity, and post-war urban policies emphasised rebuilding houses and infrastructure damaged by the war, aligning with a renewed focus on social equality and accessibility. There was a cultural renewal too. The post-war period saw a cultural renaissance in Paris, with a renewed appreciation for the city's role as the hub of art, philosophy, and political thought. Movements like existentialism and the prominence of thinkers such as Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir highlighted the city's resurgence as a space of intellectual freedom. In Nazi-occupied Paris, the right to the city was both contested and reshaped, reflecting the interplay between the authoritarian control and acts of resistance. Despite the occupation's efforts to suppress agency, Parisians found ways to resist, adapt, and ultimately reclaim their urban spaces. And that's it for today's episode. I really hope you enjoyed this look at Paris during the Nazi occupation and how this can be seen through the lens as the right to the city. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a like. If you have any thoughts, please comment them down below. And do subscribe as I bring out new episodes every Tuesday. Thank you. See you next time. Goodbye.